A new report in the New York Times suggests that what the administration sold as tough sanctions against the Russian oligarch tied to both Vladimir Putin and President Trump's convicted former campaign chairman weren't nearly so harsh after all. In fact, according to confidential documents, they freed Oleg Deripaska from hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. So let's take a look at Oleg Deripaska, once listed as the 9th richest man in the world, and the sanctions deal that the Treasury Department made with him. In the early 2010s, Deripaska entered a business relationship with Paul Manafort, who was working as a political operative in Ukraine at the time. 4 years later, the oligarch accused Manafort of disappearing with almost $19 million that was meant for investments. Manafort resurfaced in 2016, offering Deripaska private briefings on the U.S. presidential campaign, according to the Washington Post, asking a former business associate how to use his new position as Trump campaign chairman to settle up with the Russian businessman. Last April, Deripaska was one of 7 oligarchs slapped with sanctions for, quote, malign activity around the globe, part of fallout from a nerve agent attack in England. 3 of his companies were also sanctioned, but the penalties were delayed by the Treasury Department. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin conveyed a willingness to lift the sanctions if Deripaska's ownership stake dropped below 50%. But according to documents reviewed by the New York Times, Deripaska plans to transfer millions of shares in one of his companies to VTB. That's a Russian state-owned bank worth just shy of $800 million at the Moscow exchange's close today. The shares would wipe away debt that the oligarch owed that bank. Joining me now, New York Times political reporter Ken Vogel. Ken, did I get that right? Give us the big picture here, because at the heart of this, it seems, is that what the administration laid out publicly is different than what they put in privately, the documents that you were able to see.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. And to take a step back here, the motivation for the sanctions, which you laid out, were to penalize Deripaska, but they were also part of an effort to clamp down on Russia and Vladimir Putin and make things difficult for Vladimir Putin, whose government is funded in large part by these oligarchs and who has close relationships, the Kremlin does, with many of these oligarchs who were sanctioned, including Deripaska. So that's sort of the pretext here. But then the excuse that the Treasury Department gave for signaling a willingness to pull back these sanctions on Deripaska's companies was that they thought that the sanctions were hurting, having sort of economic ripple effects that were hurting companies in the United States as well as in the countries of other U.S. allies that depended on aluminum, which is the main product of Oleg Deripaska's companies. So they were seeking to minimize the damage on these companies while still having some penalties against Deripaska and to an extent against Russia. And the deal that they worked out, they said publicly, would accomplish those goals by forcing Deripaska to reduce his ownership stake in the companies and to step away from the management of the companies. And they said Deripaska won't derive any benefit from this because the shares that he'll be getting rid of, any proceeds from selling them will go into a blocked account that he cannot access. Well, what we found out in this document was that some of the shares that he was getting rid of went to entities with which he had close ties, not just VTB, but a foundation that he started and owns. Other of the shares would end up, or already are, with family members, his ex-wife and her father. And so when you add up the amount of shares that Deripaska has, which Treasury says rightfully is less than 50%, with the shares that his family and his allies have, it's actually above 50%. It's at 57%. And then you have to consider that other shares are going to these very close allies of the Kremlin, including VTB Bank. And that leads to the conclusion that maybe it's not quite so hard. This deal wasn't quite so hard on either Deripaska or Russia as the Treasury Department suggested.
Yeah, let's call them the friends and family discount or something. I don't know. But House Democrats, obviously, they thought this is not a good thing. They moved to block the sanctions relief deal and got quite a bit, I think, widespread Republican support. So what's the holdup here? It's on the Senate side, right?
Correct. Yeah, the Senate, and even in the Senate, Democrats got 11 Republican senators to come on board with them. So they had a total of 57 votes for blocking Treasury's move to lift these sanctions, which if they had gotten 60 votes, which is the requirement under the provisions in the act under which these sanctions were levied, they would have blocked the votes. But you see, I mean, there's a majority in the U.S. Senate, an overwhelming majority in the House that find this problematic. And it is in some ways illustrative of the disconnect between the Trump administration and the president in particular and his approach to Russia, which has been much warmer, less confrontational than the traditional U.S. foreign policy approach, and even more so, the traditional Republican orthodoxy on dealing with Russia, which has been to take a hard line and to levy sanctions for things like the invasion, the annexation of Crimea and the incursion into Ukraine on Ukraine's eastern border with Russia, as well as the election interference, which was a major factor. And as you suggested in your intro, Deripaska is something of a bit player in the Mueller investigation. So Democrats are saying, what's the rush to get rid of these sanctions while this guy is still, at least a subject of interest in this investigation that's hanging over the Trump administration? Why can't we wait to see what Mueller comes back with, how or if it implicates Deripaska or Manafort's dealings with him in any way, and then decide what to do about these sanctions?
Well, you kind of lay out really clearly that critics see one of two things at play here. Either the Trump administration willingly let Deripaska off easy, or they were outmaneuvered. I mean, could an argument be made for either?
Yeah, an argument could be made for either. And in fact, there's also a third possibility, which kind of plays into the question of whether they cave, which is Treasury may have inadvertently backed itself into a corner here by announcing these sanctions before doing all the due diligence on what types of economic ripple effects we might see from these sanctions on U.S. allies and on U.S. companies. And once they realized after the sanctions were announced, hey, this was going to be a big deal, it would really roil global aluminum markets, they started trying to figure out what can we do to get out of this pickle without looking really bad. And that's why you see, without looking like we're caving to Russia. And that's why you see this very complicated deal that they tried to pitch one way, but that these documents show is a lot more complex and certainly allows for a lot more ammunition for the argument that it wasn't quite so tough as they let on.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.